By the time he questioned why people treated him differently, the transformation was already complete. He didn't remember the exact moment it happened. There was no single decision, no dramatic change, just a gradual shift in how he carried himself that changed everything about how others responded to him. People who used to take him for granted now checked in regularly. Relationships that felt one-sided had rebalanced. Partners who'd been distant became attentive. And he couldn't pinpoint when it started. Because the system that taught him who he was had worked so slowly, so subtly, that by the time he became someone people feared losing, it felt like that's who he'd always been. But he hadn't always been this person. He'd been trained into it. The training started with a simple realization after a breakup. He'd been the devoted one, the available one, the one who rearranged his life to accommodate someone else's schedule. And they'd left anyway. Not for someone better. For someone who seemed harder to keep. That's when he started paying attention. Not to what people said about relationships, but to what actually worked. And he noticed a pattern. The people who were valued most in relationships weren't the most devoted. They were the most self-contained. The ones who had full lives. Who had boundaries. Who seemed perfectly capable of being fine alone. So he started a ritual. Not a conscious strategy. Just a practice. Every day, he invested in something that had nothing to do with his relationships. His work. His hobbies. His friendships. His goals. Not to make anyone jealous, but to build a life he genuinely didn't want to sacrifice for anyone. At first, it felt selfish. Wrong. He'd been taught that love meant sacrifice. That devotion meant availability. That caring meant prioritizing someone else's needs above his own. But he kept the practice anyway. Wake up. Work on his goals before checking his phone. Make plans that he didn't cancel when someone asked for his time. Say no to things that drained him, even when people seemed disappointed. It was repetition. Daily. Small acts of choosing himself that felt uncomfortable every single time. But slowly, something shifted. Not in what he did. In how it felt to do it. The resistance came from everywhere. From himself first. Every time he set a boundary, part of him screamed that he was being selfish. Difficult. That he'd drive people away. When he didn't text back immediately, he felt guilty. When he said he was busy instead of dropping everything to help, he felt like a bad person. When he chose his own plans over someone else's request, he felt the pull to apologize. To explain. To make sure they knew he still cared. His entire nervous system had been wired to prioritize others' comfort. And now he was going against that wiring. It felt wrong at a visceral level. Then came resistance from others. People who'd gotten used to his constant availability seemed confused when he was suddenly busy. Friends who'd relied on him to be the flexible one seemed put out when he had plans he wouldn't change. A woman he was dating seemed annoyed when he didn't rearrange his schedule for her. "You've changed," she said. Not as a compliment. And part of him wanted to cave. To go back to being the accommodating person everyone preferred. But something stopped him. Maybe it was exhaustion from years of being taken for granted. Maybe it was curiosity about what would happen if he stayed the course. Maybe it was the faint suspicion that people who got upset when he had boundaries weren't people he wanted anyway. So he kept going. Even when it felt uncomfortable. Even when people pushed back. Even when his old self whispered that he was doing it wrong. Then something interesting happened. The discomfort faded. Not because he got better at performing boundaries, but because they stopped being boundaries and started being just who he was. Choosing his goals before checking his phone stopped feeling selfish. It just felt normal. Like of course he'd focus on his own priorities first. Why wouldn't he? Having plans he didn't cancel stopped feeling rigid. It just felt like respecting his own time the way he'd respect anyone else's. Saying no stopped triggering guilt. It just became information. I can't do that delivered the same way as the store is closed. A fact, not a betrayal. The shift wasn't in his behavior. It was in his identity. He'd spent months practicing being the kind of person who had boundaries. And somewhere in that repetition, he'd become that person. Not performing it, being it. And that's when everything changed in his relationships. The people who'd pushed back on his boundaries either adjusted or left. The ones who adjusted started treating him differently. With more respect. More consideration. More care. Not because he'd manipulated them, but because his behavior had communicated something fundamental. This person values himself. This person has options. This person will leave if you don't treat him well. They could feel it. Not in what he said. In how he carried himself. In the calm way he maintained his boundaries without justifying them. In the full life he had that didn't revolve around any single person. In the quiet confidence that he'd be fine either way. And people who sense that, who encounter someone who genuinely doesn't need them, respond to it. They fear losing it. Because they understand, even if they can't articulate it, that this person is choosing to be here. Not stuck here. Not desperate to stay. Choosing. And choice is precious in a way that desperation never is. By the time he questioned why people feared losing him, the answer was already embedded in who he'd become. He didn't have to remember to set boundaries anymore. He just had them. Naturally. The way you have preferences or tastes. He didn't have to remind himself to prioritize his own life. It was his life. Of course he prioritized it. He didn't have to perform self-sufficiency. He was self-sufficient. The system that had trained him, the daily practice of choosing himself, the repetition of maintaining boundaries, the ritual of building a full life, had rewired his identity. And now that identity was self-policing. He didn't need external reminders to value himself. He didn't need to consciously think about whether to accommodate someone. His identity did the work automatically. When someone disrespected his time, he felt it immediately. Not as an intellectual observation, but as a visceral no. When someone expected him to drop everything, he didn't even consider it. When a relationship felt one-sided, he addressed it or ended it without the agonizing deliberation that used to paralyze him. Not because he'd become cold, but because he'd internalized a simple truth. His worth wasn't conditional on how much he gave. And that truth, once internalized, changed everything. People could sense it in him. The absence of desperation. The presence of self-respect. The quiet reality that he could walk away. And they responded to it by holding on tighter. Not to someone they pitied or felt obligated to someone they genuinely feared losing. This is how all identity works. Not through single dramatic decisions. Through systems of repetition that slowly normalize new ways of being. You practice something enough times and it stops being practice. It becomes who you are. The system that taught him to make people fear losing him wasn't a manipulation tactic. It was a training program in self-respect. Daily choices to prioritize himself. Repeated practice of maintaining boundaries. Consistent demonstration that his worth wasn't up for negotiation. And through that repetition, he became someone different. Not someone performing confidence. Someone who genuinely had it. Not someone pretending to be fine alone. Someone who actually was. Not someone trying to make people value him. Someone who valued himself enough that others had no choice but to as well. This is the power of identity formation through systems. You don't think your way into a new identity. You practice your way into it. And once the identity is formed, it maintains itself. You don't have to remember to set boundaries. Your new identity sets them automatically. You don't have to perform self-worth. Your new identity embodies it naturally. You don't have to make people fear losing you. Your new identity makes it inevitable. Because people fear losing what's rare. And someone with genuine self-respect, in a world full of people desperate for validation, is rare. Someone who's built a full life and won't sacrifice it for temporary connection is rare. Someone who will walk away from disrespect even when it's uncomfortable is rare. And rare things are precious. The system didn't teach him tricks or manipulation. It taught him to become the kind of person he'd want to keep. Someone with standards. With boundaries. With a life worth protecting. And once he became that person, once the identity was fully formed, making people fear losing him wasn't something he did. It was something that happened naturally as a result of who he was. That's the real secret. You don't make people fear losing you through tactics. You become someone worth keeping. And the fear of loss follows automatically. Not through manipulation. Through the simple recognition that this person, this rare person who knows their worth and won't accept less, might not always be available. And that possibility, that chance of loss, is what makes people hold on. Not to who you're pretending to be, but to who you've actually become.